later, because I'm going to now introduce Christopher Rose, who's a historian of the 19th and 20th century Middle East. He earned his doctorate in history from the University of Texas at Austin, yay, in 2019. He's currently a postdoctoral fellow with the Institute for Historical Studies at the University of Texas at Austin and a part-time lecturer in global studies at St. Edward's University in Austin. He is active as a public historian and founded the podcast 15-Minute History. Check it out. And served as co-host for 8 years and serving as immediate past president from the years 2018 to 20 of the Middle East Outreach Council. They do very, very important work. Check out their website. Chris also has a significant experience in educator training, particularly working with world history and world geography educators. He's conducted numerous professional development sessions for educators. That's why Jim and I knew he would be a good selection today. And he's co-written several curriculum units for K-12 classrooms and escorted numerous groups of educators to the Middle East, which I would like to hear more of perhaps later. Please welcome Christopher Rose, or do you prefer Chris?
I do go by Chris, thank you.
Thank you.
Let me get this going. I can never remember which one of these, which one of the many things I'm supposed to have up, but hopefully you are looking at my title slide. So thanks. It's great to be here. I'm always happy to help out with K-12 programming because I was for 16 years one of the people who did this here at the University of Texas for our Middle East Center. This is some new territory I haven't covered with K-12 before, and I'm hoping that this will be useful to you. So I want to just lay out a little bit of today's trajectory, which is that I consider myself a social historian of medicine. And what I mean by that is that I am less interested in the mechanics and the virology of diseases than I am on their cultural and social impacts. So what I want to do today is to tell a story about how, particularly in the 19th century, medicine and disease were used to delineate social differences. Particularly when we're going to look at two states that were really sort of two nation states rather, that were in the process of consolidating into centralized independent authorities. One is Egypt, which is a case study that I know intimately, and one is Mexico, which I will admit point blank from the outset, I am less familiar with because it's not what I focus on. But there's a lot of similarities, and one of the connections there is that both of them received much of their understanding of what constituted modern, in finger quotes, medicine and medical practice from France. And I will go through all of that. So to begin with, I want to start with just a brief history of medical practice. Who was doing medicine? What did they do? What were their roles, etc. As well as the question, I'm missing something. Oh yes, why did France come to be seen as the vanguard of modern medicine? Always fun to discover that your PowerPoint animations are mistimed. Then I want to look at how this was imported to Egypt and how it was imported to Mexico. And then I'm going to use as my case study the great 19th century boogeyman, which was cholera. So the first three sections of this talk are going to be a little more historical in nature. And then in the fourth section, which I'm hoping will comprise, I'm going to look at my watch. My plan was to go for about 50 to 60 minutes in the hope that that means I'll be done in an hour and 15 because I am who I am and I can't stop talking, is to switch over to more of the social aspect. What do I mean when I say diseases and epidemics are partially socially constructed? And then at the very end, I want to share with you some resources. Specifically, most, I would say 90% of the illustrations I have in this presentation actually came from the same online repository. And I want to show you how to access it because it's a great resource, along with a couple of others that I've used to construct this. So having worked with groups like this before, I know that what I'm doing and what I'm saying may not necessarily be 100% applicable. In fact, probably more like 10% applicable to a lot of classrooms, because this is something that gets elided and it's not a major theme in world history classes or AP World History. So what I'm hoping is that the concepts that I'm raising are things that you will be able to run with, and that you can pick out nuggets from what I'm saying. And if not, then at least I will show you some great resources that you can use to do other things with. But again, my hope is that you'll find portions of this whole, of this talk useful as we move forward. So let's start with a brief history of medical practice. So there was a sea change in the way medicine was practiced in Europe, and I'm going to look at Europe first and then move outward from there, because in terms of colonial experiences, much of the world wound up being forced, usually, to adopt European medical practice over the course of the 19th century, 18th and 19th centuries. So we're going to start there, and then I'm going to move outward to explain how other societies viewed health and the human body. So there were basically 4 different kinds of medical practitioners. And what's fascinating about this actually is that these medical practitioners actually have direct corollaries in most of the Islamic world. You'll find that, for example, in Egypt and Iran and India, you had pretty much the same 4 categories of people practicing medicine. I should also, I apologize, I meant to say at the beginning, I will be sharing this PowerPoint with the organizers, so please don't feel as though you have to write everything on the slides down. You'll get all of this information. So sometime around the year 1350, physicians and surgeons became different occupations. Physicians were at a higher rank. They practiced what we would mainly consider internal medicine, with the major caveat that they never opened up the body to look inside to see what was going on in there. So basically, there was a lot of diagnostics, there was a lot of listening, there was a lot of taking symptoms. Physicians were usually university educated, and just to give you a sense of where they were getting their education, part of their training involved education in theology. So physicians were people who were affiliated with the church. So part of it was theology, part of it was law, and part of it was medicine. So if you can imagine, basically only about 1/3 of their training actually involved sort of medical knowledge. Physicians were at the top end. They were very well paid. They tended to treat rich people, and mostly only rich people could really afford to see them. If you were a normal person, normal meaning somebody like us, somebody who was middle class or lower class, most of your emergent medical needs would be met by a barber surgeon. This was not considered a professional category in the same sense that physicians were. Barber surgeons learned through apprenticeship. They learned by doing. And yes, it is unfortunately a vast oversimplification to say that the reason that the barber surgeons were a separate field was the fact that they were skilled with sharp knives. And so they could do things like lance boils, they could cut off abnormal growths, they could set limbs, anything physical that involved exposed flesh, that involved sewing up cut open veins, that was something that a surgeon could do. The third were the pharmacists. And what's interesting about the pharmacists is that their practice actually changes very little even as medicine becomes professionalized over the course of the 19th century, which is something that I will discuss a little later on. And so this is supposedly Ibn Sina, the Persian physician who's known in the West as Avicenna, who is lecturing on pharmacy. Pharmacy changes very little, and the reason it changes very little is because basically all pharmacy up until the modern industrial age, when chemical compounds could be synthesized in industrial settings for pharmacological purposes, basically it all involved plant extracts, herbs, spices, things that had medical applications, the use of poultices, that sort of thing, what we would basically now consider herbal medicine. And I'll touch a little bit on this when we get to Egypt, but pharmacies were common throughout the known world. Of course, if you're familiar with, for example, what we now call Chinese herbal medicine or Ayurvedic medicine from India, or even, for example, down here along the US-Mexico borderlands where we have the curanderas, where basically, you know, they refer to them as healers, or the not polite term is witch doctors, but basically they're also using herbal medicine. So in many ways, modern pharmacology moved away from what these people were doing, but it's still based on what they were doing. And then finally, you'll notice these were all categories of men, midwives. So the midwife, in addition to being a professional woman whose job it was to assist women with giving birth, also were basically responsible for meeting essential obstetric and gynecological needs. It was not considered proper for a male physician to examine female anatomies. And so basically a midwife would usually intercede. Even if, for example, they were going to get a surgeon, the midwife would frequently be the person doing the actual physical examination, while who would then tell the male doctor what she was seeing and take instruction from him. So again, this is the way things were done in Europe up until the mid-18th century. This is the way things were being done throughout much of the Islamic world. This is the way things are being done in India. So there is a bit of a universality to this sort of division of labor. So up until roughly the French Revolution, starts a little before, but roughly the French Revolution, the prevailing theory of the body was humoric medicine. It's, by the way, humoric, not humorous, although to our modern eyes, it might also appear that as well. And so this was the idea that the body was made up of four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, each of which has a particular characteristic. So they could either be hot or cold, and they could either be wet or dry, despite the fact that they were all bodily fluids. How you get a dry bodily fluid is really just sort of beyond my comprehension sometimes, which is just go with me here on this one, okay? And so if a person was out of balance, if they felt ill, if they were coughing up blood, for example, the most, I think, stereotypical understanding of humoric medicine is, for example, if somebody was coughing up blood, the understanding was that it was because they had too much blood in their system. And this, of course, is when you went to get the leeches. And you would remove blood from their body. The idea being that and the reason why I say it's stereotypical is because if you watch those period dramas, it's the only thing they actually do, get the leeches and bloodlet. That was not the only thing that that physicians did. There are 3 other fluids that had to be kept in check as well. And there were different ways, different methods that this could be done. So for example, if you had an excess of a hot fluid, they would recommend foods that were considered cold that you should eat, or they would recommend that you sit in, for example, a cold room, that you bathe in cold water or something like that in order to adjust the humors. Now, we look at this now as a sort of, I don't want to say primitive, but a very simplistic understanding of medicine. And one of the things that I always am at pains to point out is that this understanding actually came from Galen, the Roman physician, and it was adopted by Islamic medicine. They also carried this idea of the humors. And it lasted up until, you know, the 18th and 19th centuries in Europe. Systems don't last that long if they're not working. So clearly, you know, medicine is fairly positivist, by which I mean you do something, it either has an effect or it doesn't have an effect. And if it doesn't have an effect, you understand that it doesn't work and you go try something else until you find something that does. So yes, if somebody's coughing up blood and you bleed them, they will eventually stop coughing up blood, not for the reason that people suspected, but they weren't looking inside the body at the time to understand that. So, excuse me, this system was replicated in India with the system that we know as Ayurvedic medicine, which is actually far more complex. There are many more levels of humors. There are many more kinds of balances that have to be aligned, some of which are spiritual. And so the whole idea here is of holistic medicine. So it involves your diet, it involves meditation, it involves exercise, it involves all sorts of things. And in fact, when Europeans first started going to India in the 17th and 18th century, this is with the French and followed by the British, they actually briefly considered the idea that in order to survive in the climate in India, because Europeans were being exposed to diseases they had not been exposed to before, possibly one of the things that you should do is consider the advice of native Indian doctors. However, later on, with the advent of more colonial mindsets and the mindset that Europe was superior in all things, that idea was set aside. Basically, the idea of humoric medicine also existed in pre-Columbian America, which did have, in addition to a rich herbal pharmacology here as well, a basic idea of the humors, as well as a pantheon of gods and goddesses that were related to various bodily functions and illnesses. There is a scholar of the history of medicine in Mexico who has actually argued, not unsuccessfully, I would say, that when the Spanish arrived, the system they brought with them and forced people to adopt was probably less effective than what, in particular, the peoples of the Valle de Mexico, where Mexico City it was or is, was in fact better than what the Spanish brought in. So the system that the Spanish brought in was far inferior in many circumstances. So what changes is, and why France? Why do we suddenly come up with this new understanding of medicine? Is of course the revolution in France, 1789. The French Revolution happens, and what it does is it severs the link between the crown and, well, everything, because it severs the head of the crown, but the other thing it does is that the French monarch was closely aligned with the Catholic Church. The kings of France considered them the most Catholic kings. They are members of the Bourbon dynasty. The Bourbon dynasty had also been installed in Spain. So what happened in France also happened in Spain, which meant that university curricula had to be approved by the crown, or at least agents of the monarchy in both countries. And since both were aligned with the Catholic Church, that meant that in particular medical curricula could not go against church teachings. And of that, what was really sort of holding the field back was what was the question of human dissection. So the problem with human dissection is that in the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, cutting open a dead body is considered profaning the dead. It is considered an act of desecration, and it is deeply, deeply disapproved of. So the idea that someone could take a cadaver and cut it open to examine the inner workings of the musculature, of the circulatory system, of the digestive system, to determine how the parts fit together, how they worked, was anathema. So, for example, this painting from 1632 from the Netherlands is an anatomy lesson that is taking place by a Dutch doctor, Nicolaas Tup. But it's like Rembrandt painted a picture of it. And the reason that this dissection was able to happen was the man on the table had been executed for a crime and excommunicated, and therefore his body could not be buried in a religious cemetery. So it was one of the few that was available for scientific research. This is one of the only conditions under which this sort of thing could take place. And so what we see is that, interestingly, the place where modern medical science begins to emerge, and when I say modern, I mean what we now refer to as anatomical medicine, which is the sort of medicine the doctor that I go to or you go to practices today, comes out of a university in southwestern France near the Mediterranean coast at Montpelier. It's one of Europe's oldest medical schools. It was officially sanctioned by the French crown in 1202. However, it was far enough from the seat of power. There's no bishopric in Montpellier. The crown representatives weren't local, that even though it was technically a university that reported to the French monarchy, they were able to do things that the universities in Paris and Toulouse could not. And one of the things that they were able to do, well, first off, because of its location, they allowed students from Muslim Spain to enroll, both Muslims and Jews. So they had access to that proliferation of medical literature that was circulating in the Mediterranean. So they had both the stuff coming from Christian Europe, they had access to stuff that was being produced in Spain, in Cairo, in Baghdad, and access to things that those people had access to. So materials that have been translated from Persian or from Indian languages, or even from Chinese. So in other words, they had a much richer library, they had a much richer understanding. And when some scientists further east began experimenting with dissection on, for example, severed limbs or whatnot, they were able to start doing this a little bit earlier. And in fact, during the French Revolution, the school was only closed for years. Most of the universities in France were closed longer. It was only closed for a year. It closed in 1793 and reopened at the end of 1793 and reopened at the beginning of 1795, continuing to, and its curriculum changed very little. whereas the universities of Paris and Toulouse had to have their curricula de-Christianized. And the reason why I'm going to such lengths to tell you about the University of Montpellier is that this has a direct link on what happens, how this understanding of modern medicine gets transferred to Egypt. So the second part of this is Clot's Egyptian experiment. But before I go on, are there any pressing questions that I need to address real fast?
I don't think anything's come through in the chat, Chris.
Cool, just checking. Let me know. Okay.
Will do.
So, in 1798, Napoleon Bonaparte, who had, I suspect, been driving the Revolutionary Committee in Paris completely insane because he wanted to do all of these things, decided that he was going to best Britain by invading India. Now, you'll notice that this has nothing to do with anything on the slide in front of you. I'm getting there. Of course, it had long been understood that Egypt was this very small piece of land that you had to cross, and that if you could go across the Mediterranean, transport something, maybe build a canal, that it would shorten the trip to India substantially. So the French go off to Egypt. Under Napoleon Bonaparte, it is one of the worst blunders in military history. They land at Alexandria, which in the year 1798 is basically a village of a few thousand people. They dock they leave their ships in the harbor, offload all of their troops, head off inland. The British fleet under Lord Nelson shows up and sinks the entire French fleet. They stay in Egypt for 3 years, not because they're really occupying the country, but because they're stuck there, and are eventually evacuated on British ships back to France. What they do while they're there is compile a very encyclopedic understanding, or it's literally called The Description of Egypt. It's in about 14 volumes. You can access it online through the World Digital Library, although it is in French. But one of the staff of the French army were particularly interested in Egyptian medical knowledge. And one of the reasons for this was that when the Crusades happened, and yeah, I'm going back 500 years, when the Crusades happened, there had been a hospital in Cairo founded by the Mamluk Sultan Qalawun that was famous throughout the Islamic world. It was endowed by through a religious endowment called a waqf, and it was a marvel of the medieval world. And they went looking for this hospital, which was still in operation, although after 500-600 years it had fallen into a bit of disrepair and wasn't being used very much. But they also wrote, for example, a number of reports that give us a good benchmark as to where things were in 1798, 1799, 1800, against which we can compare the rest of the trajectory of the 19th century. So, for example, the French doctors who had been trained in this new anatomical medicine, which is very scientific, because one of its goals, by the way, was to bring surgery and surgeons and physicians back together, right? That surgeons should be physicians, or at least have trained alongside them, and also to professionalize pharmacists, so that pharmacists were dispensing medicine that had been recommended by physicians. You know, the system we understand today, or that we're used to today. And so they, for example, took lists of all of the drugs that were being sold in the pharmacies. And one of the things that they came away with was they were actually very derogatory toward it. But a couple of scholars about 30 years ago went through the list and said, you know, 75% of all of the drugs that appear on the official list of pharmacies in Cairo are actually on the official dispensaries in both England and France. And the one that was published in England was used throughout the English-speaking world, including the Americas. They had little quibbles for things like, well, this guy prescribes opium, not for pain relief, but for stomach concerns. And they didn't like things like that, even though it actually worked. But we get a baseline understanding that these guys who were writing these things were officers in the French army. They were upper class. And what they didn't really understand was that, quite frankly, the average Egyptian probably had access to the same level of medical care as a contemporary who lived in rural France. Now, this is to say that neither of those was particularly good. But we go back to Montpelier again, and it's continuing to churn out these graduates. And one of the most famous, or the most important for this story, is this man, Antoine Barthélémy Clot. Clot. In Egypt, they pronounce the last name with the T. In French, it's not pronounced with the T. So he's Clot in France and Clot in Egypt. And he winds up being the architect of the Egyptian medical system. Now, he does this at the behest of the Ottoman Viceroy of Egypt, who is this man, Mehmet Ali in Turkish, Muhammad Ali in Arabic. He is an ethnic Albanian who was born in Thrace, which is now northern Greece, who served in the Ottoman Turkish army and eventually came to be the Viceroy of Egypt. Did you follow that? He's like in himself a one-man example of the Ottoman experience, this great multinational empire that pulls people from all over the place. And Muhammad Ali, who is actually the exact same age as Napoleon Bonaparte, even though he always seems to be depicted much older, becomes the viceroy in 1805. And he recognizes that Egypt has economic potential it's not living up to. And he goes about seeking basically the best models for beginning to develop the country. Through this, a number of historians have argued that through what he did, through creating a national standing army corps, through forced labor corvées that pulled people out of the fields during the months that they were under inundation to do things like dig canals and drain the marshes in the Delta, he sort of brings Egypt unwillingly into a new place, although he does it with a lot of violence. There's an awful lot of state violence under him, and so he's remembered both very positively and very negatively at the same time. Modern historians, Egyptian historians included, will have enshrined him as the father of modern Egypt, but there's a lot of people who remember that he did a lot of things that weren't terribly popular as well. So he wants to build up Egypt's focus as a mercantile trading hub. He also wants to build up the military because the Ottomans had a habit of trading out governors every 3 years, and he doesn't want to do that. So he raises a very large army, and in the 1820s, they're actually able to threaten Constantinople itself, after which he is proclaimed to be the governor for life, and that the line is hereditary and will pass to his descendants. He is the precursor to the Egyptian royal family that lasts until 1952. As part of his military strategy, a couple of things happen. The first is that there's an epidemic of plague in the 1820s. And the second is that while the army is marching to and from Istanbul, an extraordinarily high percentage of his soldiers come down with syphilis. There's nobody to treat them. And syphilis is at the time uncurable. Remember, we don't have antibiotics. And it knocks soldiers out of commission for at least 8 weeks if they're laid up in the hospital barracks, in the military barracks. And so one of the things he decides he needs is a military medical corps. And this is where we enter Clot. He contracts Clot, who is 31 years old at the time, to come to Egypt to establish a medical corps, to train basically army officers who will be able to keep the army in fighting order. Clot, coming from France, comes to Egypt and says, okay, look, here's what needs to happen. Military health and civilian health are interlinked. Because this is what we have done in France, this is something Napoleon emphasized significantly, is the idea that healthy mothers produce healthy sons, and healthy sons go on to work as healthy nations. So you have to have more. You can't just have military doctors, because if you wait till they've been recruited to the military, you've missed all of this opportunity. And Mehmet Ali says, okay, go for it. And so Clot, and the date on this, by the way, is wrong. It's 1831, not 1821, establishes a medical school in Egypt, which is still actually functioning. Its descendant is the Medical School of Cairo University. And they have the same issue that they have in France. They have to get over the distaste for carving up dead bodies. But they recruit medical students. The first class is a bit weird. Clot speaks no Arabic yet. The students speak no French. So they have to have people who teach at Al-Azhar, which is the Islamic university, come and translate for all of them. But this painting, which is of unknown provenance, purports to show the first anatomy lesson that was given at Cairo University. Now, Clot himself left a lot of writings. Many of them are on the website of the French National Library, although I will repeat my earlier caveat, they're in French, and not a lot of them have been translated into English. But one of the things that that happens early on is a story, and it may just be a story, but follow me here. And those of you who are familiar with the Orientalism critique, just pay attention to the way the story goes. So it is said, or Clot says, it's not it is said, Clot stated that in an early lecture of anatomy, one of the students was so horrified at the desecration of the corpse on the table that he couldn't help himself, and he grabs a knife and he lunges at Clot, who just very calmly raises his arm, gets hit in the arm, and then proceeds to teach the rest of the lesson while bleeding. And of course, here in one instance, you have and I'm sure Nuket Varlik talked about this, the ignorant East and the enlightened West, all coming together in one cute little incident. But Clot was actually very successful. One of the things that he really wanted to do was to Egyptianize the faculty of the School of Medicine as rapidly as possible. So the 12 best graduates from the first graduating class were sent to France to sit for their diplomas at the unit by taking their board exams in France from French examiners, because he got a lot of criticism both locally in Egypt from European consuls as well as in Europe from people who said that Egyptians did not have the ability for higher thinking that was needed to be a physician. And so basically, in order to prove them wrong, he sent these guys off to France to take their exams, which they did successfully. And very quickly, by 1840, all of the faculty of the School of Medicine were Egyptian. All the lessons were being delivered in Arabic, although they were still using European textbooks that had been translated. In fact, those of you who are familiar with, if you're familiar with the intellectual history of the Arab world, there was a scholar, Rifat Tahtawi, who founded a school of translation. And one of the reasons his school of translation was founded was to translate these textbooks from Europe for the schools of medicine, engineering, agriculture that had been founded under Mehmet Ali in order to modernize the country. So hospitals were founded throughout the country. You can see here on this map, this will not appear on the exam, that they created a network of hospitals all throughout the country. However, one of the things that they discovered very quickly is people don't like hospitals. Nobody liked hospitals at the time, quite frankly. Hospitals were, there was a cultural preference in Egypt, but also in most of the world at the time for treatment at home. The doctor was supposed to come to you. The idea that you would perform intimate rituals like giving birth, having surgery, or dying in a barrack-style facility where you were among strangers because your entire family couldn't come with you, and that was one of the things that they could do at home, is everybody could care for you. And so the hospitals were actually severely underutilized. And so the Egyptian state had to respond, and what they did was they created dispensaries where they had doctors who would treat people outpatient, pharmacists who would give them medication, and then send them home. The other thing that there are two other significant factors that really sort of win over the Egyptian populace. One is the smallpox vaccination campaign, which begins in earnest in the 1830s. This is about the time that the vaccine was introduced worldwide. Smallpox was a huge problem in Egypt. It carried off tens of thousands of people every year. And they met with a lot of resistance when the graduates of the medical program met with resistance when they would go into the countryside, because the memories of the labor corvées of the 1820s and 1830s were still very strong in their mind. And so they were afraid their kids were, stop me if you've heard this one before, that their kids were going to be tracked somehow, that they were being poisoned, that they were being marked for future military recruitment, that this is all part of some sort of state control mechanism. Almost by providence, an epidemic of smallpox comes through, and the kids that had been vaccinated didn't get sick. And suddenly it was very, very popular. And by 1850, Egypt had one of the highest vaccination rates of young men and women in the entire world, higher than England, where, by the way, vaccination was deeply unpopular for all of the reasons that you can find if you go to any anti-vax group on Facebook right now. Nothing has changed. This is one of the fascinating things about studying medicine, is especially right now during a pandemic, is none of the arguments from people that are being posted that they're worried about the coronavirus vaccine or wearing masks or any of it, none of it's new. We've seen this all before. The other thing that happens is that Clot realized that because of the strict gender segregation of Egyptian society, that there needed to be a core of women who could serve women. And so they created a medical school for women. It was called the School of Midwifery, but the women were trained in far more than just being midwives. They were actually given pretty much the same treatment as men, with a couple of added courses in gynecology. And these women, who were usually, by the way, married to graduates of the men's school, so that they would be in a situation where their husbands wouldn't object to them working, took over the supervision of the traditional midwives in many cities throughout the country. Rural coverage was a bit spottier because there were far fewer graduates of the female school. The first class actually consisted of slave women and concubines from the royal palace, because they couldn't get enough, because free women of upper classes didn't work in Egypt. And so they had to literally bring in recruits to become doctors and nurses. I am way behind time, I apologize. eventually, what winds up happening over the 1850s and 1860s is they begin training the traditional barber surgeons and the traditional midwives in medical practice, holding series of workshops or classes so that people could get certificates and whatnot from the state. And over the course of the 19th century, the Egyptian state becomes the provider of legitimate medical knowledge in Egypt. And this becomes the first litmus test. Well, one of many litmus tests. But bear this in mind, is that the question of who you get medical care from is a mark on your acceptance of the central state's authority and therefore your loyalty. And we'll see this again as we come to Mexico. I'm afraid Mexico doesn't have quite as colorful a story in this regard. But I did just want to talk about where Mexico was in the 19th century, because there are many similarities and there are many differences. That was probably a really silly thing for me to say, I'm sorry. So Mexico, of course, has a longer history of interaction with Europe from the early part of the 16th century onward. The first medical supervision in Mexico came through an organization called the Protomedico, which is right there in the second line in case you're wondering how to spell that. Protomedico, the first doctor, which was actually an advisory council. It was, as you can tell by this portrait, this is the Protomedico of Mexico in 1714, that he is a clergyman, that he is appointed by the king, that the medical school is a religious institution. It's the Colegio Máximo de San Pedro y San Pablo, and that medical education in Mexico is very closely linked to the Spanish crown and the Catholic Church. What this means is that local people who seek treatment from herbalists who continue to practice are considered to be practicing heresy, because this is not treatment that is regulated, that is not approved by the Catholic Church, and it's not approved by the Protomedico. So unfortunately, I have a very long list of things to say here. So the primary difference when we get to the 19th century, Mexico gets its independence from Spain over the course of the 1810s. The difference between Mexico and Egypt in the 19th century is that the Egyptian state is, in all honesty, far more powerful and far better centralized than the Mexican government. Post-independence Mexico has a relatively weak central government that is constantly flirting with bankruptcy. It has to contend with the fact that the Catholic Church is entrenched as an organization, that it still has a substantial amount of control, even though by this point, the Spanish crown has been, Spain's been invaded by France. The Bourbons are sitting on that they're basically puppets of France. That the Spanish crown still in post-independence Mexico maintains a level of control over things like the curriculum at what should be Mexican state universities, and they have the backing of the Catholic Church, which means they don't have the freedom to change this system up. The Protomedico, in fact, remains in existence through, and I have the three national organizations that were designed or intended to be syndicates of physicians practicing in the country, to basically do the sort of same thing that the Egyptian College of Medicine did. Everyone was a graduate of the College of Medicine, and so everyone was by extension on the faculty or had an honorary appointment. And so it was sort of a labor union syndicate slash provider of standards. Well, you had two competing organizations in Mexico over much of the 19th century. It wasn't until 1861 that the proto-medico was abolished. In particular, the problem in Mexico was that the periphery of the country, places that were farthest away from Mexico City, were at times very resistant to control. There were a number of succession crises and civil wars over the course of the 19th century. Some of you probably know this very intimately, probably better than I do, but it's important to this story because in Mexico, as in Egypt, physicians recognized that the future of medical science was coming out of France. And so they increasingly sought out training from French professors or French physicians, either by going to France or by welcoming French physicians who basically had to flee the revolution. And they founded new institutions that were not under the control of the Church of the Crown. What you're seeing here is a painting of the University of Jalisco in Guadalajara. The Mexican state tried to support them, but failed 3 times through the 1831, 1841 revisions. It wasn't until 1861 that they were able to create this sort of national idea. The point of these different associations is to shift who had medical knowledge away from the proto-medico and away from illegal practitioners. So there are 2 kinds of illegal practitioners in Mexico, and this actually differs substantially from Egypt as well. Getting your medical license is extremely expensive. It cost 500 pesos, which was a lot of money in the 19th century. So there were a lot of men who, and unfortunately they were men, I'm not being sexist here, the profession was limited to men. There were those who received training at the university but couldn't afford to pay the licensing fee, and there were those who remained practitioners of herbal medicine. Oops, sorry, I just did something and now I can't get to my next button. There we go. One of the key parts of Yucatán, one of the key parts of Yucatán, well, I just gave away the punchline there, in Mexico, that's in the periphery is the state of Yucatán, which was Mexico's wealthiest state in the 19th century. And it was the wealthiest state in Mexico because of the henequen industry. Henequen is a fiber, in English we call it sisal. It's used to make rugs. At the time it was used to create ropes that were usually used in tying together agricultural products. And Yucatán was full of plantations, but it was actually the wealthiest state in the Republic. Combined with the fact that that Yucatán is very thick jungle, it's very difficult to control, and that unlike the indigenous populations of the Valle de Mexico, the Maya who live in Yucatán have never been fully subdued under state authority. So Yucatán itself succeeded from Mexico in the 1840s for a bit. And from the 1840s through the end of the 19th century, various Maya groups were in conflict with the state in what has become known as the caste war, the caste war, the war of the Guerra de las Castas. And medicine winds up playing a huge role in this because it became, again, a way to delineate those who accepted the central state's authority and those who did not. The smallpox vaccination campaign in Yucatán was far more problematic than it was in Egypt. Well, actually, it met with the same resistance, they just never overcame it. It had to be administered by a state licensed physician. This basically meant that there were suspicions, same ones as in Egypt. People were being marked, people were being tracked. There was also a cultural aversion to it because in Mayan culture, vaccination was seen as an act of violence because it involved puncturing the skin. And that was inappropriate for a stranger from outside the local group to perform. The Maya themselves, of course, were not considered worthy of learning how to perform the procedure because of the long-standing prejudices, especially in Yucatan, between themselves and the Creoles, who were intermixed Maya and Spanish at this point, but were usually the upper class and the elites of Yucatan. So in a very real way, district medical officials and vaccination officers were on the front line of this larger political conflict because they were the ones on the ground. And they were the ones, and the way that their knowledge was received, the way that they were received in villages when they came to perform inspections or vaccinations in a particular village would be reported back to political and military officials, and this would be used to form judgments about who was likely to support the rebels during the war and who was likely to support the central state. This, for the record, becomes very common throughout colonial settings. Africa, Asia, wherever European, British, French, Spanish colonies are, this idea that we are bringing you modern medicine, and if you don't take it, that casts doubt on your loyalty and worth as a human being, is quite prevalent among them throughout the colonial settings. I covered quite a bit of this in a class I taught. Okay, I realize I'm over time, but I'm not done yet. So let's switch now to get away from medical history, and let me talk about, I want to talk about cholera as the 19th century litmus test. But first I want to talk a little bit about how disease is socially constructed. And what I mean by this is obviously diseases are real, just like race is real, even if race is not a biological thing. Diseases are actually viruses, they are medical conditions. But when I talk about things like what is the social construct of a disease, what I'm saying is, first and foremost, there's usually an element of fear. One of the key shared experiences that makes an epidemic an epidemic is the social dimension. Otherwise, it's a virus going for MVP of the year. The social component is what makes an epidemic event, and trauma, which the previous speaker brought up at the very end, is a key component of that epidemic experience. So I won't read these all to you, but you can see them. So if these sorts of questions, how is the disease perceived? Who gets it? How is it spread? What do we do with the dead? Mass burial and cremation, for example, is very common in epidemic situation, because, especially in the 19th century, because until 1884, when the existence of the cholera bacterium was confirmed, the miasmic theory prevailed, which is the idea that atmospheric conditions or certain gases would contributed to disease spread. And one of the key vectors for this was believed to be that people who died of the disease emitted noxious vapors, so they had to go on the ground, or something had to be done with them as quickly as possible. So this is why you see a rush to mass burial and a rush to cremation. But just to sort of give you a little sense of what I'm talking about here, is this. This is a cover actually of the last issue of the Advocate magazine, which is talking about coronavirus, and it's invoking AIDS. And I think this is probably more than coronavirus and COVID-19. AIDS, I think, is quintessentially the social illness with which we're all familiar. The way that in its early days, it was extensively linked with homosexuality. It was considered a gay disease, that there were incredible misunderstandings or misconceptions about how the disease could be spread. Of course, those of you who are of a certain generation will recognize the AIDS quilts, in which each panel was contributed by in memory of somebody who had died of the illness. But it remained very, very powerful. So this those of you who remember, for example, the movie Philadelphia coming out in 1993, this Oscar-winning film with Tom Hanks and Denzel Washington, and Tom Hanks is playing a gay man who's dying of AIDS. But you know, it impacted an entire generation of people. I mean, I myself, when the movie came out, I was 18 years old. I was struggling with my own sexuality because in the back of my head, I grew up in Ohio, was the idea that if I came out as a gay man, I was eventually going to contract and die of AIDS. You know, it's like, even though I knew that that wasn't who the population was limited to, these are things that are very, these are hard social ideas to overcome. So the social stages of an outbreak, and there are many, are these four. And no, don't stop me if you've heard this. I'm going to say it anyway. Number one, in an epidemic, there's usually, first thing that happens is there's denial that the disease is even occurring. So when cholera first arrived in New York City in 1832, and when I say it first arrives, I mean it very first arrived, it took 6 weeks for the Board of Health to recognize the outbreak officially. The New York Medical Society publicly stated that the first cases, the first 9 people had died of cholera, and they were attacked by others in New York who felt that the announcement was premature and unwarranted. In particular, the idea that the city should be quarantined was considered distasteful because it would harm business interests. The second thing that happens is blame. Someone or something is blamed for the disease. So the Black Death of the 14th century was attributed in parts of Europe to Jews, of whom it was said they were poisoning wells, and many of them were burned at the stake. I'm sure Nichat Varlik pointed out that another part of European conception of the plague was that it could not have come from Europe, and it must have come from the East, because people in the East did not share European understandings of health, hygiene, and care of the body. You have uncertainty. When a new disease arises, you have the combination of a public who wants answers and a medical profession that is just as uncertain about the provenance and effective treatment for the new disease as everyone else. So as a result, society views the physicians in medicine of the time as having failed. This usually leads to the rise and promotion of alternative treatment therapies, many of which are not only ineffective, but are actually harmful. And fourth, epidemics stimulate a variety of new laws usually to prevent this sort of thing from happening again. Initially, some of these laws are viewed as immediately necessary to prevent or control an epidemic, but they often remain in effect long after the epidemic is gone. This goes hand in hand with the idea that the state is seen as responsible for guarding public health because legislation is seen as proactive. It's funny how this was actually, I got this out of an article that was written in the 1980s, but it's funny how it seems like it could have been written yesterday, doesn't it? I'm gonna try to wrap up in 10 minutes. Let's see if I can do it. Cholera is the 19th century boogeyman. It is a disease that first appeared in Europe between 1830 and 1832. It came to the Americas in 1832, 1833. It is a particularly spectacular disease. And when spectacular, I mean, it can kill a person within a matter of hours. For those of you, I don't know how many of you have read The Secret Garden, the children's book that was written probably about a century ago. It starts in India, where the girl who is the heroine of this story, her parents die. She goes to bed, and when she wakes up, everyone in the house has died of cholera that they contracted. Basically, it is contracted by ingesting the virus, which has come into contact with bodily fluids that have been infected with or contaminated with the cholera virus, and it basically causes people to dehydrate by vomiting and expelling all of their bodily fluids through everything. It's not pleasant at all. It's definitely when I originally started working on my dissertation, I thought I was working on cholera, and inevitably at dinner parties, people would ask me how you get it, and it's not dinner table conversation at all. But it is a very rapid onset disease, and it turns out in the time since the 19th century that the disease actually, the virus itself is not actually that harmful. It is the rapid dehydration that kills people. And so since they have employed, WHO put a huge amount of funding into making rehydration salts available, especially in developing countries where the disease is endemic. And it has reduced the death toll dramatically. It was just one of those things where people didn't know where it came from. They didn't know how it was spread. They knew none of it. It just appeared, and it seemed to fester and kill en masse. Cholera is an invader, and I want to pause here for a second to inquire, and I may need some help from the mods. How is cholera depicted in this painting? I am asking the group.
Chris, they all know because they've seen this before. This is actually one of our
God, darn it.
This was one of our primary documents that we discussed in an earlier session. But as an Indian, as a foreigner, the responses are jumping into the chat.
Okay. Take my joke away for all right, fine. So let's just go directly into the next question, which is, cholera came from India. The question is, why was that important? Why was it important that cholera came from India? So there's a couple of interesting things here. There are a couple of theories. Cholera is not really known on the historical record before about 1800. And there's a couple of theories that are not mutually exclusive from one another. The European scientists who first investigated it decided that it must have been in India since antiquity, because if you go through some of the historical records and fables or whatnot, there are people who display stomach discomforts, and the sort of decision was at the time that, again, because Indians are Orientals in the European imaginary, that they cannot possibly understand health hygiene in the body, and so they didn't recognize it for what it was. The other theory is that some mutation happened around the turn of the 19th century, and that what begins to spread around the world outward from Bengal in 1817 is a new virus, or at least a far more lethal virus than anything that had previously been seen. Like I said, these could both possibly be true, that it was a much more localized illness, but because we don't have the samples to do the DNA, although more scientists tend to lead toward the idea is cholera is an old disease, but something happened that made it more virulent around that time. One of the things that that was used as example is the fact that there was actually a goddess of cholera in Bengal, and so this linked to the idea that it must have been old. If there was a temple dedicated to Ola Devi, who is this goddess, she's yellow and she wears a blue robe. But then it turned out that she was actually new, or at least she was a minor deity who had been reappropriated as the goddess of cholera, because there's no record of her having been worshipped prior to the beginning of the 19th century. So it was known as the blue disease because a number of the victims turned blue because they were so dehydrated from the loss of fluids. And when it arrived in Europe, it was important that it be identified as a foreign agent. Any stomach upset, any sort of gastroenteritis, having the runs, anything like that was referred to as cholera before 1800. Afterwards, it was specifically this Asiatic cholera or this Indian cholera to denote the fact that this is the one that's going to kill you because it comes from India, or it came from India to kill you, one or the other. Either way, the implication being that the tropics in particular were reservoirs of germs and illness that were dangerous to European bodies. Cholera is a disease of the poor. What does that mean? Well, it means that poor people seem to contract it more. And so this is around the time, this, of course, it wasn't until 1853 that Jon Snow, not the dude from Game of Thrones, a scientist in London, is able to trace the outbreak to a water pump, and they were able to realize that contaminated water carried whatever it was. Prior to this time, however, it was understood that disease tended to proliferate in poor neighborhoods. And so causal agents were looked for in those poor neighborhoods. And one of the things that it was decided was that these people a number of them lived amoral lifestyles, which meant that they, for example, for a long time, cholera was associated with prostitution, even though it is not a venereal disease. The other thing is that it seemed to proliferate in these areas. Of course, now we know it's because there was no sewage in poor areas. Sorry, there was no modern sewage. So wastewater and drinking water usually were able to mix at the ground level. And so wells would be contaminated, and people were living on top of each other. They didn't have adequate disposal methods for things. But at the time it was used as judgment. So the common phrase used to describe this is that these people lived in filth. And the thing that that we don't fully understand today is that filth, because today it's kind of a generic term, it's a little bit of a level just below dirty, things are filthy, we use this all the time. Filth was a biological product. Saying that somebody lived in filth was deeply, deeply pejorative. They were saying that people lived in shit. Okay, that's the impact the word filth had in the 19th century. So when you read some of these historical documents and they say filth, that is not a benign term at the time. It is basically saying that these people are living in pools of their own feces and urine and vomit because they're not smart enough to clean them up. And so this, for example, here is the London Board of Health prowling through a neighborhood looking for the cause of cholera, and they're looking, in grates and pig pens and haystacks and things. But to bring the story back, because I'm way over time, are a couple of reports that came out from Mexico. So you can see here, I will not read this for you. This is the official medical pamphlet that was put out by the Central States, in which you can see all sorts of assumptions that are made about the way poor people live. They shouldn't lay on the ground. They should do certain things. They need to ventilate their room. They need to regularly remove the excrement outside because most people didn't have toilets, so they would use a bucket for the purpose, and somebody would come by and collect it. But again, the assumption here is that they're living in their own filth.
Down to cook tortillas.
I'm sorry. I just heard somebody say, how do you use dung to cook tortillas? It is actually, this is a common thing on the steppes of Asia too, where dung is cheap fuel. And that's one of the reasons why you cook on a flat surface, is because it heats up real fast. And so it's really good for flatbreads because you only have to cook them real quick on each side. But it is actually a common fuel source. Here's another one. Oh yeah, poor people. Poor people have a very bad habit. Actually, the word in Spanish was fatal, although that doesn't necessarily mean fatal, because they take tequila on an empty stomach, and that just really lambasting the eating methods of the poor. Because if you know Mexico in the 19th century, high-class people didn't eat what we would call Mexican food. They ate French food. So the idea that they're eating things like chicharrón or avocado or these things that are considered peasant foods is very derogatory. They're considered uncivilized because they're not living at the same standards. In 1854, when cholera hits the Yucatán in the middle of the war of the caste war, the disease's spread was used by the military as a means to get into villages because they knew that people were weak because they contracted the disease. There were also widespread suspicions of the Maya throwing dead bodies into wells to